Well, I don't think that the social sciences can make any real contribution to that. Because I do not think that is the most exciting question that the social sciences have to answer. What the social sciences can do is to reflect on the relevance of that question. And that is something that takes us into methodological issues, which are really very important. Well, basically what I mean is that we are taking the world as it is now for granted. What we tend to ignore is that the world that we live in is one amongst many possible worlds, and that the world we live in is with us because other worlds were made unfeasible, right? So, you know, through colonial rule, Europe actually imposed its own future on Africa. So the future that never was is exactly, precisely, you know, the future that was stolen, was taken away from Africa. So that is what I was talking about. You see, that's the problem. It's on several levels. The first level is that the notion of the future itself already implies a certain kind of understanding that somehow preempts our answers. So the future is, you know, what is ahead of us, right? You know, what is still to come. And somehow, I think, you know, like I was saying in my talk, the social sciences are the product of the Enlightenment Project. And the Enlightenment Project had actually this idea that you can turn the future into something that you can manage, that you can turn it into a social project, so you can intervene into the future, right? So it is this idea that, you know, we can do things now that will determine how we are going to live tomorrow, right? And, you know, that's a problem, I think. Now, the second thing is that, I mean, it's not like everyone in the world is worried about the future. I mean, even if you take it from a practical point of view, the major concern that people have in Africa is with today. It's with taming today. The third thing is that we should be careful, and I'm not saying that this project does that, but you know, there is a way of asking trivial questions that, you know, we should be careful about. You know, everything we do is about the future at some level. You know, our conversation today is going to have implications tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and maybe in 10 years, right? So, you know, the assumption that you can study the future without really being more precise about what you mean by the concept, about the relationship of that concept to political programs, the relationship of that concept with other concepts like the past and the present. If you don't do that, then you are calling for trouble. Our lives, modern lives, have been largely determined by the knowledge that is produced by the social sciences. So in a way, the social sciences are there to produce knowledge that is supposed to organize people and to manage people, right? And my point was that, you know, so somehow there is a political project attached to the social sciences. And if you don't spell it out, you may end up thinking that you are doing work on the future, whereas you are not. What you are doing is creating the conditions that will enable you to intervene into people's lives, right? So you are studying Africa not because you are interested in the future, but because you want to produce the knowledge that will help institutions to intervene into the lives of Africans, which I think is highly problematic from, you know, simply from an ethical point of view. These people haven't asked you, you know, to come and do that to them. They have not asked to be changed, to be developed. And they haven't asked for any of that. So we need to be careful. But you see, I like your question, because what it does, it puts me on the spot. Because you see, I'm criticizing all of this, and the force of my criticism comes from who I am, from the fact that I am an African, right? And so it's not easy for me to talk about these things with you or on a purely scientific level. You hear me and you see the African speaking, and that's a problem for me, not for you. It's a problem for me, because for me to be able to articulate my discomfort with this, I have to use your language. I have to I have to appeal to Heidegger, of all people. I have to appeal to Foucault. I have to appeal to a vocabulary that has a place of origin, and that's Europe. That's 19th century Europe. The social sciences were born in that time, and they were a response to issues here in Europe. They were not a response to issues in Africa. They were a response to issues here. And somehow we make the assumption that this response to very particular local issues at some particular point in history is adequate enough to respond to whatever issue you have elsewhere in the world, like in Africa. But then again, it's very hard for me to justify my position, because basically I'm speaking your language and complaining, and I'm not saying anything new actually. If you look back into the history of European intellectual thought and so on, it takes someone like Montesquieu and his Persian letters. So these Persians who visit France and stay there in Paris for 9 years and write letters about Europe and make Europe strange, right? In the way that I'm trying to make Europe strange now. And that was done by Montesquieu, a French thinker. Or take de Montaigne, another French thinker, who writes about the cannibals, right? And who asks the question, who are actually the cannibals? The American Indians who eat the people they kill in war, or us, who kill people in the most horrible ways, and don't eat them, right? So it's your question is a very tough one.
But you found a very elegant way to do it. And I take it as critique from within, right?
Yes, that is it. It's a critique from within, but you see, the problem is that it's very hard for people to see that it is a critique from within, because it's me making it. So what they see is an African speaking, but what they fail to see is that the African who is speaking is one who is using their vocabulary. I'm not using any vocabulary that you wouldn't understand. But this is what science is all about, I think. Well, I think the methodological challenge is not to take concepts for granted. Concepts are not innocent. They have a history. They make assumptions. So those things need to be spelled out. And often we don't do that. So a concept like future is not an innocent one. I don't think that people in this project are making that mistake. I don't think they are. They are aware of it. But I think they need to be reminded that a concept like future is not innocent. The first thing is that I don't think that it is a bad choice to focus on rural Africa, because you choose your object depending on your research interest, particularly depending on what you want to understand. It's been a staple of African studies and generally of general opinion on Africa to make a distinction between rural Africa and urban Africa, with the assumption that rural Africa is much more representative of Africa because, you know, that's where you find the traditions, the customs, and so on, right? And it's a problematic assumption that people make because rural Africa is actually a product of history, right? You know, you have rural Africa because you have urban Africa. Right? Now, those two things were created by history and by a very particular history. And unfortunately, that particular history is the history of colonialism. I'll just give you an example. You know, one thing that is an issue in Africa, has always been an issue since independence, is the lack of social policies, the lack of social security institutions, you know, in the same way that, for example, you would have them here in Germany, introduced by Bismarck and so on, so many years ago, right? We don't have that. And why don't we have that? We don't have that simply because colonial states made the assumption that Africans will be taken care of by their communities. So they work. You know, you don't need a pension because when you go back to the village, your extended family and so on will take care of you, right? So you see the rural being created by state policy.